You have to understand something most people completely misread when it comes to avoidant behavior. When an avoidant pulls away, the instinct is to assume disinterest, rejection, or emotional detachment. But that assumption is often not just wrong, it's the exact opposite of what's actually happening beneath the surface. Because when an avoidant is truly indifferent, they don't half leave. They don't create distance and then quietly maintain a thread of connection. They don't circle back, check in, or leave subtle openings for communication. They simply disconnect, clean, quiet, and final. But that's not what you see when they're in love. What you see instead is this confusing pattern. They step back, but they don't disappear. They go quiet, but not completely silent. They create space, but somehow they're still there. And that contradiction is not a game, it's internal conflict. You're witnessing someone who feels deeply, but doesn't feel safe inside those feelings. Avoidants are not avoiding you as much as they are avoiding the emotional intensity that you trigger in them. And when that intensity rises beyond what they know how to regulate, their instinct is distance. Not because they don't care, but because they care in a way that feels overwhelming, unfamiliar, and at times even threatening to their sense of control. So they pull back to stabilize themselves. But here's the part most people miss. Even in that withdrawal, they leave a door open, a message here, a reaction there, a sudden check-in that seems small on the surface but carries weight underneath. These are not random behaviors. These are controlled forms of connection, ways of staying emotionally linked without fully exposing themselves. It's like they're saying, I can't handle all of this, but I also can't let you go. And that space in between, where they are neither fully present nor fully gone, is where their truth lives. Now, this doesn't mean the behavior is easy to deal with. It can be confusing, frustrating, even painful. But if you look at it through a psychological lens instead of an emotional reaction, it starts to make sense. You're not dealing with someone who lacks feelings. You're dealing with someone who lacks the capacity to consistently manage those feelings. And so they oscillate. Connection distance, connection again. The mistake people make is chasing harder when the avoidant pulls away, thinking intensity will close the gap. But intensity is exactly what caused the gap in the first place. What actually reveals the truth of their feelings is not how they act when things are easy, but how they behave when they create space. Do they vanish completely, or do they stay loosely tethered to you? Because that tether, that subtle, almost invisible thread, is not indifference. It's attachment trying to survive under pressure. And once you see that clearly, everything changes. You stop personalizing the distance as rejection, and you start recognizing it as a coping mechanism. Not a healthy one, but a revealing one. So the next time they pull away, don't just look at the distance. Look at what remains. Look at the door they didn't fully close. Because sometimes the strongest sign of love isn't someone staying perfectly present. It's someone who can't fully walk away, no matter how hard they try. There's another layer to this that most people completely overlook, and it's subtle. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. When an avoidant is in love, they may step back physically or emotionally, but they don't disengage mentally. In fact, in many cases, they become even more attentive, just not in a way that's obvious or direct. They watch, not in a controlling or unhealthy sense, but in a quiet, observational way. They notice your patterns, your energy shifts, your presence online, your absence, your tone. They become highly aware of you without necessarily interacting with you. And this creates a paradox that can feel confusing. Someone who appears distant on the surface, yet deeply tuned in beneath it. Now, why does this happen? Because observation feels safer than participation. For someone with avoidant tendencies, direct emotional engagement can feel like exposure. It requires vulnerability, responsiveness, and a level of openness that they may not feel equipped to sustain. But watching allows them to stay connected without risking rejection, without losing control, and without having to confront emotions they don't fully understand. So instead of expressing, they study. Instead of asking how you feel, they try to read it. Instead of showing you that you matter, they gather information that confirms it to themselves. And this is where people misinterpret silence. They assume that if someone isn't speaking, they're not thinking. If someone isn't acting, they're not feeling. But in the avoidant mind, silence is often full. It's active. It's processing, analyzing, trying to make sense of emotions that don't come easily. You might notice this in small ways. They view your stories but don't respond. They remember details you don't recall telling them. They reference things you said weeks ago, even though they seemed disengaged at the time. These are not coincidences. These are signs of attention without expression. And attention is investment. Here's the deeper psychological truth. People do not consistently observe what they do not care about. The mind doesn't allocate energy, focus, and awareness to something that holds no emotional relevance. So when someone continues to monitor your presence in their life, even from a distance, that tells you something is still active within them. But again, this doesn't mean it's healthy or sufficient. Observation is not the same as connection. It doesn't replace communication, and it doesn't build a relationship on its own. But it does reveal something important. They haven't emotionally checked out. They're still engaged, just internally. Now, the challenge for you is not to overinterpret or become reactive to that behavior. Because if you start performing for their attention, trying to provoke a response or adjusting your actions to be seen, you lose your center. And once you lose that, the dynamic becomes unbalanced. The power is in recognizing what their behavior means without chasing it. You understand that their silence doesn't equal absence. Their distance doesn't equal disinterest. And their observation, while quiet, is a form of connection they feel safe maintaining. But you also understand your role. You don't reward passive attention with active pursuit. You don't confuse being watched with being valued at the level you deserve. You stay grounded in your own standards while seeing the situation clearly, because clarity changes how you respond. And when you respond from clarity instead of emotion, you stop trying to force someone to show up in a way they're not ready for. And you start allowing their behavior to reveal the truth over time. So if you find yourself wondering whether they care, don't just look at what they say. Look at what they consistently pay attention to. Because where attention goes, emotional energy follows, and that energy doesn't lie. Now, when you begin to understand that they don't fully leave and they don't fully disengage, and you recognize that they're still watching, still paying attention in their own quiet way, the next piece starts to make sense. And this is what? Things become even more misunderstood. They don't express their feelings directly. They test. And to the untrained eye, testing can feel like inconsistency, mixed signals, or even manipulation. But at a deeper psychological level, it's something far more revealing. It's an attempt to answer a question they don't know how to ask out loud. Are you safe for me to love? You see, for someone with avoidant patterns, vulnerability is not natural. It's risky. It's associated with loss of control, with past disappointment, sometimes even with emotional pain they haven't fully processed. So instead of stepping forward and saying, this is how I feel, they create situations that allow them to measure your response without exposing themselves. They might pull back slightly to see if you chase. They might delay a response to see if you remain steady. They might act indifferent to see if your behavior changes. Now, this is where most people fail the test, not because they're not worthy, but because they don't understand what's happening. They react emotionally. They overextend, overgive, or overpursue, thinking that more effort will create more connection. But from the avoidance perspective, that intensity can feel overwhelming. It confirms their fear that closeness leads to pressure, expectation, and loss of space. So instead of feeling safer, they feel the need to retreat even more. But when someone responds with grounded consistency, when they don't chase, don't collapse, don't become reactive, that's when something shifts. Because now, for the first time, the avoidant is experiencing connection without chaos, interest without pressure, presence without demand, and that's unfamiliar but powerful. Testing, in this sense, is not about controlling you. It's about regulating themselves. It's their way of slowly approaching something they fear without fully stepping into it. It's cautious, indirect, and often unconscious, but it's meaningful. Think about it this way. When someone doesn't care, they don't test. They don't evaluate your consistency, your patience, or your reactions. There's no reason to. Indifference doesn't need reassurance, but interest does. Now, this doesn't mean you should play along with every test or tolerate unhealthy behavior. Awareness is not the same as acceptance. You're not here to prove your worth or pass someone else's emotional exam. What you're doing is recognizing the pattern so you don't misinterpret it. Because when you misinterpret testing as rejection, you either chase harder or walk away prematurely. But when you see it for what it is, you respond differently. You stay centered. You don't perform and you don't withdraw out of fear. You remain consistent in who you are. And that consistency becomes the answer they've been looking for. Over time, if the connection continues, something interesting happens. The tests become less frequent. The distance becomes shorter. The moments of openness, those small cracks we talked about earlier, start to widen. Not because you forced it, but because you created an environment where they didn't feel the need to protect themselves as intensely. That's how trust is built with someone who fears it. Not through pressure, not through persuasion, but through stability over time. So if you ever find yourself confused by their mixed signals, ask a different question. Instead of asking, why aren't they expressing how they feel? Ask, what are they trying to understand through their behavior? Because when someone tests your presence instead of declaring their feelings, it doesn't mean there's no emotion there. It means the emotion is real enough to be protected. And once you begin to recognize the pattern, the distant, the observation, the testing, you start to notice something else that doesn't fit the surface narrative. These moments that seem to come out of nowhere, brief, unguarded, almost accidental openings where they reveal something real, they open up, but not in a way that's predictable or sustained. It might be a late night conversation where they suddenly share something personal, a story from their past they don't normally talk about, a truth about how they feel, quick, unpolished, and then just as quickly, it's gone. Or a moment where their tone softens, their guard drops, and you get a glimpse of emotional depth that doesn't match their usual behavior. And if you're not paying attention, you'll dismiss it. You'll think that didn't mean anything because it wasn't consistent. It didn't last. It didn't come with a clear declaration or a steady follow-through. But that's exactly why it matters. Because for someone who is avoidant, consistency and vulnerability is the hardest thing to maintain. It's not that they don't feel deeply. It's that accessing and expressing those feelings requires them to move outside of their emotional comfort zone. And when they do that, even briefly, it takes energy, it takes effort, it takes risk. So those small moments, they're not small from their perspective. They're significant. They're the result of an internal negotiation between the part of them that wants connection and the part that fears it. And for a moment, connection wins. For a moment, they allow themselves to be seen, but because they're not yet fully comfortable in that space, they retreat again. Not to erase what happened, but to regain their sense of control. Now, here's where people often get it wrong. They either cling to those moments, trying to recreate them, or they dismiss them entirely because they're not consistent. Both responses miss the deeper truth. You're not supposed to chase those moments. You're supposed to recognize them. Because those brief windows of vulnerability are like signals. They show you what's underneath the protective layer. They reveal that there is emotional depth, that there is trust trying to form, that there is something real, just not yet stable. And stability takes time, especially for someone who has learned, consciously or unconsciously, that being open leads to discomfort. So instead of forcing consistency, what actually moves things forward is how you respond in those moments. Do you overreact? Do you interrogate? Do you try to lock them into that vulnerability and stretch it beyond what they can handle? Or do you receive it calmly? Do you create an environment where opening up doesn't feel like a trap, but like a safe experience they can return to? Because every time they open up and don't feel overwhelmed afterward, something shifts internally. The fear loses a little bit of its power. The association between vulnerability and discomfort weakens. And slowly, over time, those moments begin to connect. What was once rare becomes occasional. What was occasional becomes more natural, but only if it's not forced. This is where emotional intelligence becomes more important than emotional intensity. You're not trying to extract feelings. You're allowing them to emerge. You're not demanding clarity. You're recognizing progress even when it doesn't look perfect. And that requires patience. Not passive patience, but grounded awareness. The ability to see what's real without needing it to be constant. Because with avoidance, consistency doesn't come first. Safety does. And when safety is established, consistency follows. So the next time they open up, even for a moment, Don't measure it by how long it lasts. Measure it by the fact that it happened at all. Because sometimes the moss, honest expression of love, isn't found in long speeches or perfect timing. It's found in those brief, unguarded moments where someone finally lets you see what they've been protecting all along. Expand key point 5 into a 600-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Tony Robbins' approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights shared. And as you begin to see the distance differently, to understand the observation, the testing, and those brief moments of openness, there is another moment that reveals even more than all of those combined. It's the moment when the dynamic shifts. When you start to pull your energy back, this is where the truth becomes undeniable. Because when an avoidant senses that they might actually lose you, not in a dramatic confrontational way, but in a real grounded withdrawal of your presence, something inside him gets activated. And it's not always graceful. It's not always clear, but it's real. You'll notice a change. Someone who was distant becomes more attentive. Someone who was slow to respond suddenly reaches out. There's a shift in urgency and tone and behavior. And it can feel confusing, almost contradictory. You might think, why now? Why when I'm stepping away? But psychologically, it makes perfect sense. Avoidants are comfortable managing connection at a distance. They know how to regulate when things feel under control, when they can create space, when they key and engage on their terms. But when that control is disrupted, when they feel that the connection is no longer guaranteed, it triggers something much deeper than their usual patterns. It triggers the fear of loss. And here's the key distinction. Avoidants don't always fear closeness as much as they fear losing someone who matters. Those are two very different things. Closeness feels overwhelming, but loss feels final. So when they sense that you're no longer emotionally available in the same way, that you're not waiting, not chasing, not orbiting around their pace, it forces them to confront something they've been avoiding, not you, but their own attachment to you. And that confrontation creates movement. Now, this doesn't mean every reaction will be healthy or fully conscious. Sometimes it shows up as increased communication. Sometimes it's subtle, more engagement, more presence, a softening in their energy. And sometimes it's messy, confusion, mixed signals, even frustration. But underneath all of it is one truth. Your absence has meaning to them. If there were no feelings, there would be no reaction. Indifference doesn't create urgency. Detachment doesn't suddenly become attentive. When someone truly doesn't care, your distance simplifies things for them. It doesn't complicate them. But when they do care, your distance disrupts their internal balance. And this is where your role becomes critical. Because the goal is not to pull away as a strategy to provoke a reaction. That becomes manipulation, and it keeps both of you stuck in a cycle. The real shift happens when your distance is genuine. When it comes from self-respect, from clarity, from recognizing that you cannot carry the emotional weight of the connection alone. When your energy changes because you've centered yourself, not because you're trying to control them, that's when the response becomes meaning. All data. You're no longer chasing clarity, you're observing it. And if they move toward you in that space, if they show increased effort, increased presence, even in small ways, it tells you something important. It tells you that beneath their avoidance, there is attachment, there is value, there is something they are not ready to lose. But again, awareness is not the same as tolerance. Just because someone reacts when they feel you slipping away doesn't mean the dynamic is automatically healthy or sustainable. It simply reveals what's there. And what you do with that information, that's where your power lies. Because now you're no longer guessing, you're no longer interpreting silence or distance without context. You're seeing how they respond when the possibility of losing you becomes real. And that response is honest in a way that words often aren't. So if you want to understand how someone truly feels, don't just watch how they behave when you're fully present. Watch what happens when you're no longer as available as you once were. Because sometimes It's not your presence that reveals their feelings, it's your absence. And when you step back and look at all of it together, the distance that never fully becomes disappearance, the silent observation, the testing, the brief moments of vulnerability, and the shift that happens when you pull your energy back, you begin to see a pattern that leads to one final undeniable truth. They stay. Not perfectly, not consistently in the way you might expect, but they don't leave for good. And this is where you have to think more deeply, because presence is often misunderstood. People assume that love should look like constant closeness, clear communication, and steady reassurance. And while those are healthy expressions of love, they are not always the starting point for someone who struggles with avoidance. For Anne, avoidant staying is not effortless. It's a challenge. Every instinct they have may push them toward independence, toward emotional distance, toward self-protection. And yet, despite those instincts, despite the internal resistance, they remain connected to you in some form. They continue to come back, to re-engage, to maintain a thread of connection, even when it would be easier psychologically to cut it off completely. That's not convenience, that's conflict. And conflict only exists where there is something meaningful at stake. You have to understand, when an avoidant truly doesn't feel anything significant, they don't linger. They don't maintain contact. They don't revisit the connection. They detach and they move on without looking back because there's nothing internally pulling them to stay. But when they are in love or developing something real, they find themselves caught between two opposing forces. One part of them seeks closeness, familiarity, emotional connection. Another part seeks safety, distance, control. And instead of choosing one completely, they exist in between. They stay in your orbit. They may step away at times, but they don't disappear. They may go quiet, but they don't fully disconnect. There is a pattern of return, a rhythm that once you see it clearly becomes predictable in its own way. Now, this is where maturity and awareness become essential because it's easy to romanticize this behavior. It's easy to say they keep coming back, so that must mean everything. But that's not the full truth. Staying is a signal, but it's not a complete solution. It tells you that there is attachment. It tells you that there is emotional significance. It tells you that despite their fears, they are not able or willing to fully let you go. But it does not automatically mean they are ready to love in a healthy, consistent, or fulfilling way. And that distinction matters because your role is not to decode their behavior endlessly or to wait indefinitely for potential to turn into reality. Your role is to see clearly, to recognize what their actions reveal without ignoring what they lack. You can acknowledge that their staying reflects something real while also holding your standard for what you need in a relationship. That's where balance comes in. You're not dismissing their effort, even if it's imperfect. But you're also not lowering your expectations to match their limitations. You're standing in a place where you can observe the truth of the connection without losing yourself inside it. And when you do that, something shifts, not just in them, but in you. You stop chasing certainty and you start recognizing patterns. You stop trying to force clarity and you allow behavior to speak over time. You become less reactive, more grounded, more intentional. Because now you understand something most people don't. Love doesn't always show up in perfect form, especially in someone who fears it. Sometimes it shows up as inconsistency, as hesitation, as a quiet inability to walk away. And while that may not be enough on its own, it is still meaningful. So the question is no longer, do they feel something? The question becomes, is what they can give aligned with what I'm willing to receive? Because at the end of the day, someone staying in your life, even imperfectly, tells you one thing very clearly: they haven't let you go. But your power lies in deciding whether that's enough or whether you require more.